So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate your patience with the new sign-on method. I know it's a little bit cumbersome, but it's to help keep us all safe. You know, I don't know if you've heard about Zoom bombing, but they can be anywhere from an innocent prank to something really horrible. So we're doing our very best to keep Zoom bombs from happening during any of our virtual programs. This is a virtual program called Zoom with the North Carolina Room. We've been hosting it every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, and we'll have several more of these at least throughout the summer. So keep an eye out for those on our Facebook page or on the library events calendar. As you all learned today, you do have to register for our programs now, and you can do that through the Buncombe County Library events page, or you can send me an email at pacnc@buncombecounty.org and we'll get you signed up. You can also call, and the phone number to call to register is 828-250-4709. So today I am very excited for this program. This is another one of our programs that was already scheduled to happen pre-pandemic, and so we're plowing forward, and I'm very excited to have these two folks with us and to see their faces, even if it is virtually. So our program today is going to be presented by Zoe Rhine, who's the former North Carolina room manager, recently retired, looking very well rested and refreshed. And Joe Newman, who is a former teacher and professor of education. Is it Southern Alabama? South Alabama University. And these two have been working for, 2 years on this same kind of research, looking at the origins and the history of Asheville's segregated school system. They've been learning all about the teachers, the first teachers, so it's what we're going to talk about today, as well as exploring some of the teachers who were very important during the later years of our segregated school system. So many of you might have attended a session like this, but live last April, where Zoe and Joe talked about the teachers at Stevens Lee High School. And today they're going to take it all the way back and talk about the very first teachers there. This presentation is a part of our larger Black Asheville History Project, and if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read you the description very briefly. The Black Asheville History Project is a campaign spearheaded by the North Carolina Room at Pack Memorial Library in coordination with the Buncombe County Community Engagement Team and other community partners to build a more representative and diverse collection of historical materials related to African Americans in Buncombe County and other communities in Western North Carolina. The project began in early 2019 and will continue through at least 2025 or until the project reaches our ultimate goal, which is ensuring that at least 25% of the North Carolina Room's collections catalog pertains to the history of African Americans in our county and region. So right now, that number is at about 2% of our entire collection looks at the history of African Americans, and we have that audacious goal of getting up to 25%, but we can do that with your help. So one of the things I'm kind of mourning in our pandemic losses is this weekend would have been our very first history harvest for this year, which is a very important part of our collections goals. A history harvest is a day where we invite folks from the community to share their archival materials with us to make them publicly available for research and community use. And our first two we had in November were really successful. We ended up with more than 600 new images for our collection, and we really hope to do some more of these. So those will happen maybe in the fall, but as you all know, we're all playing things by ear these days. So, but be looking out for more Black Asheville History Project related material. We'll probably be doing a talk with Steve Nash, who writes about Reconstruction in Asheville and Buncombe County, to talk a little bit more about the Freedmen's Bureau and why those records are so important. So if you have any questions about the Black Asheville History Project, be sure to send us a note. I think most of you know who I am. I'm Catherine Cutshall, the North Carolina Room Manager, and without further ado, I think I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters for today. So, Zoe, Joe, it's all yours. Yep.
Catherine, just want to thank you for getting this all set up and for dragging me into the world of Zoom. Before we begin, I just want to add a note here that for this program, whenever Joe or I use the term colored or a few times Negro, it is because we're referring to either a published newspaper source or information taken directly from the Asheville School Committee minutes. Both of these sources at this time only use the word colored. So there were the white teachers and the colored teachers, the white school and the colored school. And we thought it was important to stay authentic to our sources, even though the term is a little rugged on our ears. Joe?
All right. Catherine, you got me on? All right. I want to thank Catherine, and I want to thank Zoe, my colleague and research partner for 2.5 years now. When we did a program last April, we titled it A Tribute to the Faculty of Stevens Lee. That was the regionally famous all-black high school in Asheville. And now we're going all the way back, as Catherine mentioned, to the very origins of the Asheville City Schools. So we could well title this program A Tribute to the First Black Teachers in the Asheville City Schools. And we do want to pay a tribute. These are the people, we've called them builders of black schools. These were the first 5 teachers hired. And they did a superb job under very stressful conditions, brand new game for everyone of getting the black part of the school district really going. Here's a little stress relief from these virus times. I want you to imagine yourself, especially in the first part of our discussion, in the shoes of some of the participants who were on the scene. Black teachers, black students, black parents. Let me make it a little more particular. Imagine you're a child now. You're growing up in a family where your parents had both been born into slavery. It's the year 1888, and slavery has not been even over for 25 years. Now, you're the first person in your family, the very first, to have the chance to go to school, the ghost of a chance. And you and your parents want you to take advantage of that. The Asheville City Schools have just opened. This is, let's say it's the first day of school. Winter day in early January 1888. The Asheville schools are open for both black students and white students. You're a black student. Now, they attend separate schools. That's not a surprise. They were separate and very unequal. So you show up on the first day of school with one or both of your parents, and there's a big crowd of children with their parents at Beaumont Street School, the first black school. Now, you might get turned away because it turns out the building was a lot smaller and a lot less adequate in every way than it should have been. But if you're able to enroll, and I think all the kids were able to enroll within, well, by the end of the school term, you're excited to meet your teacher. So think about hundreds of black kids showing up at Beaumont Street School, holding on to their parents' hands, I'm sure, and hoping that they will be able to be admitted that day. And if you are able to enroll, you're going to be excited to meet your teacher. Your teacher. She's a woman or a man of your own race. That's important. Someone of your own race standing before you. She dresses well, she speaks well, she has some self-confidence. She's someone you can look up to. And you find out within a few days that your teacher has been to school for many years herself and may even have gone to college. College. What a tremendous accomplishment this was when you consider that most of the 5 original teachers had been born into slavery themselves, and somehow they found a way to go to college. Catherine, could we have that first image, please? Now, this is not Beaumont Street School. Zoe and I have looked and looked and looked, and we haven't been able to find an image of that first school, but this is Mountain Street School, the second black school that opened. It was opened as a replacement for Beaumont Street, and it supposedly was a little better than Beaumont Street School. If you look to the left of the frame, you see what looks like a little structure tacked on to the side of the house? Yes, it's a converted house. Well, that's an outdoor privy. And here these black students are with their teacher. Notice her in the middle of the frame. I believe that's the custodian standing next to her. All of these kids have decked out to have their photograph made. And they're a fine looking group. They're just a fine looking group. And she's the teacher. Talk about separate and unequaled. Catherine, if you'll put up the next image, you'll see what I mean. This is the first school for whites, opened on the same day as Beaumont Street School. Now imagine that. And the white kids complained about it because it was an old building. It was the Asheville Male Academy. You can see the description, I think, below it. It stood on Montford Avenue, where Randolph School and the Magnet School have stood. Still a school site, but there is all the difference in the world between the Mountain Street School you saw first, with all the little black kids out front, and this school. All the difference in the world. Catherine, if you'll put me back on screen, please. Here's something that surprised Zoe and me when we started this research. We learned that black people are the ones we have to thank for the very existence of the whole school system. It was black people who made sure that we established the Asheville City Schools. On July 28, 1887, black voters provided the crucial margin of victory in a citywide referendum that established a public school system for the city and provided tax revenue to support the schools. Now, how do we know that black voters played the key role? Well, it's clear if you read the newspaper coverage that a majority of white voters had been listening to Thomas Patton. Those of you who are here in Asheville know about Patton Avenue, large slave-owning family, and certain other white leaders. Patton held the outdated view of tax-supported schools that they were only for the poor. That was a view that school reformers in the North and the Northeast and New England and now the South were trying to get away from. They were trying to get beyond that view that if you went to a tax-supported school, it was a poor school. That's not at all what the school reformers here in Asheville had in mind. Well, but Patton, in order to discourage whites from voting or to get them to vote no, also played the race card when he told whites that a, quote, large proportion of the school fund, if it were approved, would go to pay for black kids to go to school. And then Patton kind of smugly asked rhetorically, now is that what white voters really want? Well, to make a long story short, the tide seemed to be running against a city system of public schools. So Isaac Dixon, will you please cue Isaac up? there he is. Isaac is the fellow on the left. He was the most prominent black person in the city, and he worked with a very prominent white leader, Richmond Pearson, to turn out the black vote. Pearson and some other white leaders, along with Isaac Dixon, they worked together very, very closely during this time, decided that unless there was just a tremendous outpouring of black people at the polls, black men, I should say, black men and white men could vote, not black women or white women. That if blacks really turned out at the polls, they could overcome the white vote, which was narrowly divided or probably leaning against the school taxes. So black people turned out in droves. They did vote in huge numbers, and the referendum was approved by, listen to this, a margin of 722 to 718. 4 votes, 4 votes. Now, to reward black people for their support, for what this was, it took a lot of whites by surprise, I think, that this happened. Isaac Dixon was appointed by the Board of Aldermen to a 2-year term on the first city school committee. That was the school board. And let me tell you, in the South, the presence of a black man on a public school board was most unusual, most unusual. I'd never heard of one before in this era. Now let's take a look at some of these amazing teachers, these builders of black schools. Zoe is going to speak for a while. She's going to talk first about Asheville in this era, give you a little more information about what the city was like, and then she's going to do a profile of our first teacher. The first teacher we'll talk about, Harrison B. Brown.
Thanks, Joe. I do want to just address what was Asheville like in 1887 as these first 2 schools got underway. 1887 has been called the threshold year for this little town. Electric lights were put up, and the First Street Railway was serving Public Square. It had been built. Also, there was just about to begin a system of road paving. The main roads in Asheville were not yet paved, and they were often being dirt, very muddy and hard to pass. If we could look at that first picture, Catherine, this shows what at the top of South Main Street, now Biltmore Avenue.
It's the one after that one, Catherine.
Yeah, there we go. So right there at the top, looking down the street, especially in the front, you can see the big mud roots. And then the next photo is taken from the bottom of South Main Street, looking up towards Pack Square, showing trolley cars. And you can pretty much see how terribly muddy this main street, this was the main street. And if you'll notice, almost a quarter of the way up the road, you'll see stepping stones going across the street. Those were put up so people could pass to the other side of the street without getting muddy. This next view gets us a little closer to the subject of this program. This is East Asheville. You can see the Buncombe County Courthouse in view there. And the red line, thanks to Rich Matthews, is the approximate site of Beaumont Street going up the mountain, intersecting with Pine Street, excuse me. And then on up, if you notice just to the right of the courthouse dome, you'll see a small white church with a steeple. That, excuse me, that was Nazareth Baptist Church. And that's set on Pine Street. So we believe the approximate location of the Beaumont School would have been near that intersection of Pine and Beaumont. Speaking of mud streets, those paths in the picture that look like they might be cow paths are actually the roads. And it was several times published that the road to the Beaumont School was just about impassable, which again would made it hard for the Black children to attend many times. I'd like to add a note about the racial population at this time. The racial breakup. The school committee had ordered a school age census preparatory to the school's opening, and it was published in the newspaper in November 1877, with the number of total whites of school age being 1,302, and the total colored school age being 540. So I meant to check my percentage with you, Joe, but I believe that's Blacks making up about 70%. The Asheville City Alderman, today known as City Council, also had an official census ordered that was published in the 1887 city directory. So we're staying right here in this time frame. The census was compiled by the Southern Directory Company, and they gave a total figure of whites of 4,651 and colored 2,607. So I kind of add that because it's important to show that when we're talking about inequalities, the numbers weren't that far off for the inequalities that seem to keep coming. In terms of the teachers' salaries, the white teachers were paid a salary of $30 a month, and the colored teachers $25 a month, and those were for only during the school year. Joe?
You're going to do Harrison Brown, I believe.
Oh yeah, oh me. Oh, I was hoping for a throat break. We wanted to start with Harrison B. Brown because he was the first person that we have found associated with the teaching of Blacks in the public school system here. That was because he was the principal of Beaumont Academy, which was the same building as the Beaumont School, but it was operated by the county. And so it was a city school operated by the county for Blacks, and it was established by 1886, possibly 1885. So Harrison Brown was a man who made his mark as a teacher and a lawyer. He was born in Waynesville, Haywood County in 1858. That would be 7 years before the end of the Civil War. His enslaved father was Elmer Brown, also born in Waynesville. There's a short biography of Harrison Brown in the Heritage of Black Highlanders collection at UNCA. And it tells us that Brown was educated in the Episcopal Parochial School in Asheville. This would refer to Trinity Chapel, later St. Matthias, where the city's first school for Black children was established in the church basement in 1870. So that was real early. Brown would have been 12 in 1870, and it's a good guess that he would have attended the school around this time period. By 1878, at age 20, he had married Rachel Earl. Because there are no records left from Trinity or later St. Matthias, we're very lucky to have an article published in the newspaper in 1875, also right about the time Brown would have been attending the school, where a group of visitors, which included Reverend Buxton of Trinity Episcopal Church of Buxton Hall fame, and Thomas Walton Patton, who Joe just talked about, and some other visitors, There were about 100 day students that day, and I'm going to quote from the newspaper: "The promptness with which these colored children answered questions in geography, arithmetic, spelling, and the Holy Bible with promptness were really noticed, and the group also noticed that they were impressed with the children's writing skills." So that lets us know at least that the school had a very well-rounded curriculum. That same biography I mentioned in the Highlanders collection also says that Brown taught in Hendersonville, North Carolina for 5 years. That would have been prior to 1885-86 when he returns to Asheville to be principal of Beaumont Academy. Wasn't able to verify that, but I'm still working on it. It's very possible that Brown may have had no more formal education than what he received at Trinity Chapel. But when the Asheville School Committee hired him in 1887 to teach 29 second graders, he would have by then had connections with both Black and white Asheville, and he would have been an experienced teacher by that point. He continued to teach in the school system through the 89-90 school year before he branched out into quite a few other endeavors. One of the most important ones is in 1893, he became a founding member of the Young Men's Institute, the YMI, built by George Vanderbilt, and Joe will be referring to that, and we'll see pictures of it. The YMI, which housed businesses on the lower level, soon became the center of African-American business and culture. Brown, along with another of these first teachers, Lipscomb, which Joe will talk about, were both admitted to the bar in 1896. So in my view, these are the first two African-American lawyers to practice in Asheville, not Reuben Daly. If you could put that street photo up, Catherine. Oh, I missed that slide. We've not been able to find a photograph of H.B. Brown yet, but the North Carolina Room staff first became familiar with him when someone was renovating a house on East Chestnut and just brought in and handed us this photo. Betsy Murray, who was on staff at the time, primarily initially just because of the location of this cart of children in front of W.O. Wolf's shop, which is the shop there on the left, had a hunch and proved that those were author Thomas Wolfe's siblings in the cart. And the next slide shows a little closer up of Harrison Brown's shingle he hung, attorney at law, on the outside of the building, and it's a little blurred, but on the entrance upstairs to his office, it's his name, H.B. Brown. If I can go to one more close-up view of the people in the cart. This building at Forecourt Square was in the business center of downtown Asheville. It was also just one block from the Black Business and Residential Center of East Asheville. And so Brown's law office in the heart of the city symbolizes his success and his acceptance by people of both races. At this time, we didn't know about Brown's earlier profession as a teacher, but I'd like to make one further suggestion, also based primarily on location, that the woman standing at the back of the cart may very well be Harrison Brown's wife, Rachel, and the woman to the left may be their oldest daughter, Rachel. They would have been 20 and 35. At first, we were guessing maybe these were nannies for Wolf's children, but it just was very unlikely that Julia Wolf would have had nannies. And these women are very well dressed, and it would just adding this because it would be amazing if these were Harrison's wife and daughter. One more item that may be a total coincidence is that the Browns named their youngest daughter Effie, and they may have named her after Effie Wolf, who was born 6 years prior. Effie Brown died in 1910 at the age of 17 of typhoid fever, and she's buried in Riverside Cemetery. Even after Brown had established his law office, the biography I mentioned, and I quote, says that he was heavily engaged in educational activities such as teaching and principalships and other things connected with education. I was able to verify that Attorney Brown served as both principal and teacher, at least in 2 years, at the Trinity mission, which also had become St. Matthias when he was teaching there. So Brown was obviously dedicated to the education of the race. He also founded a newspaper, the Colored Enterprise. Many of you will remember that was the only extant paper that was found in the time capsule of Vance Monument when it was taken up in 2015, and it had been placed there in 1898 by the Masons, of which Brown was a 33rd degree Mason. Surprisingly, Brown and his family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, probably about 1914, and he continued his work there as a lawyer. Another of their child, or Wilda, died there in 1928. Harrison B. Brown died in 1930 at the age of 72. And the next slide will show his tombstone at the Knoxville National Cemetery. It was placed there in 2000 by the U.S. Veterans Affairs Office. You see that it's got him listed as a first lieutenant. He served along with his friend who they started the Colored Enterprise with, Thomas Leatherwood. And they joined a group of all Black, all men from Asheville called the Maseo Volunteers for the Spanish-American War. They were gone about 114 days. The biography that I keep referring to in the Black Highlanders collection, I believe the content to be entirely correct because it was written prior to Brown moving to Knoxville. And it also states that he owned a great deal of property in Asheville and that he, quote, made it possible for many Blacks to own their own homes and businesses. This too is obviously a very important contribution that Brown made to Asheville, and the kind of thing that would have been very difficult to find by research, even to verify by research. So we're very, very grateful for that document's existence and for its preservation. Back to you, Joe.
All right. Catherine, would you please put up the next image? Mr. Suggs. There he is. This is Daniel Cato Suggs. You can see his name below the image. He lived from 1865. He was born 2 days after the Civil War ended, so we might as well say that he was born into slavery because it didn't end as quickly as it should have. And he died in 1922. Now this fellow, you can almost see this in his eyes. He was career-minded. He was called Professor Suggs. Even elementary teachers who were men were often called professor, but he climbed up the educational ladder as far as he could. He started out as an elementary school teacher. He moved quickly into college teaching, and then he ended his career as a college president. And here's a fellow who just missed being born into slavery. Now, the thing about these early teachers to a person, but I'll talk about it in the context of Mr. Suggs because he talked about it a lot. He firmly believed that the work he did at every step of his career, moving up the ladder, was not ambitious, was not ambition. It was a contribution to helping his race rise up and move ahead. Black people were taught, whether in the lower grades or in college, and he was fortunate enough to go to college, that they were blessed to be able to go to school, and the way they repaid that debt was to devote their lives in some way to uplifting the race. And he talked about this a lot. He was born in Wilson, North Carolina, 2 days after the Civil War ended. Graduated at age 19 from Lincoln University in Oxford, Pennsylvania, a historically black college and university. Those are often abbreviated nowadays, HBCU. He later earned a master's degree at Lincoln. Now, he was the first teacher who came to the Asheville City School Committee's attention. You could say he probably applied first. The members thought highly of him, the members of the school committee. He arrived in Asheville with several years of teaching experience in the Kinston, North Carolina public schools. And here in Asheville, his assignment was teaching a class of 21 4th and 5th graders, the oldest and most advanced students in the school. And I think the committee thought he was a very, very bright and academically talented man, which he was. He taught at Beaumont only 1 year. I told you he moved up the ladder, and he left to become a department chair in math and science at Livingstone College, a historically black college in Salisbury, North Carolina, affiliated with the AME Zion Church. Would you put up the image of Livingstone College, please? There you go. I'm sure it was not just the awful working conditions, the terrible crowding in the classrooms, and the other substandard conditions that he had taught in Asheville that prompted him to leave. But from the building you saw earlier to this building, a frame structure with all the proud students out in front of it, there was just a world of difference. So I'm sure he felt he had entered a different world, having taught elementary school in 2 cities. And then here he is at a department chair of math and science at Livingstone. But this man did not forget Asheville. At the Colored Teachers Institute held in Asheville in 1891, he, in the words of the Asheville Citizen, gave an interesting and valuable address on the conditions of the colored race and their duty and power. And then it quoted some of his direct words. Listen to this man's words. The teachers of the race are to be the factor in the elevation of the race in the present age. They are to lead out in this development of the forces that belong to this race. That's giving a lot of importance to elementary and secondary teachers. The factors in the elevation of the race. If you'll put me back on, Catherine, please. Professor Suggs kept moving up the educational ladder. He did pause for 20 years. This was his longest time in one place as department chair and vice president of Georgia State Industrial College for Colored Youth in Savannah. And then Livingstone, you saw the image of the Livingstone building, called him back in 1922, and made him president of the college. Now, what an achievement for a man who was born to newly liberated slaves. Booker T. Washington's biography was called Up from Slavery. I'm certain Mr. Suggs, Professor Suggs, had read it, and he is a perfect example of someone who came up from slavery and at every stage tried to help others up. He merited a listing in the Negro Yearbook of 1922. It was a kind of who's who, a biographical dictionary of notable black leaders. And that same year, Asheville invited him back again. They thought highly of the man. to deliver the commencement address at Catholic Hill School, the forerunner of Stevens Lee. Would you put up the YMI images, please? Yeah, that's the single image, that's fine. Because Catholic Hill had burned down the first school, let me pause and make this point. The first black school that was built as a dedicated school building, the first real school building black people had, tragically burned in 1917. And because of that unfortunate, terrible circumstances, the exercises of commencement were held at the YMI, the Young Men's Institute downtown, built in 1893. That building is still there. I have been to several functions there, been to meetings in the huge auditorium, and it's impressive to me to know that I'm in a room where Mr. Suggs and others spoke and where they actually lived and breathed. That same building is there. And around the corner is the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in its present building that dates back to 1919. Professor Suggs died in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1936 at age 71. Would you put up the image of Professor Lipscomb, please? This man was very similar to Cato Suggs in many ways. Professor Lipscomb may have been the most accomplished of the 5 original teachers. You mean more accomplished than Daniel Cato Suggs? Well, I have to give the nod to this man, although I have no right to do that. He certainly was the busiest. This guy maintained the busiest schedule I've heard about. Makes my head swim. He worked parallel careers in religion and education, so that in schools, he was Professor Lipscomb. And in his church work, he was Reverend Lipscomb. And like Professor Suggs, he practiced and preached racial uplift as he pursued one career goal after another. He was born in Orange County, North Carolina in 1858, showed a variety of talents at an early age. He was a great singer, for instance, and he joined the North Carolina Jubilee Singers in 1873 and went on the road with them, touring to raise money for the historically black Shaw University in Raleigh. Would you put up the image of Shaw, please, Catherine? I hope you can see the caption at the bottom. The mother of all historically black universities in the South, Shaw University was the first college created for African Americans in the southern United States. And this is where Professor Lipscomb, Mr. Lipscomb at the time, studied. While he was there, boy, he was an academic whiz. One of his professors and he founded a racial uplift journal. Imagine doing that as an undergraduate. After he graduated, Shaw kept him on for 2 years while he worked on his master's degree, and he taught math and languages. Now, he moved around the state for several years, and I'm going to give you kind of a list of the things that he did. School principal in Raleigh-Durham, officer of the Baptist State Convention, which ordained him as a minister. He was a Baptist preacher. A professor at Shaw, the editor of a religious journal, the founder of a training school for preachers and teachers and other religious workers, which he named the Western Union Institute for Colored People. And he moved it when he came to Asheville in 1886. Well, I think you can see what I mean by this fellow was busy. He was making a name for himself, and he won a place in the 1887 biographical dictionary, Men of Mark, Eminent, Progressive, and Rising. And, Zoe, we're going to have to watch our time here. This man's career in the Asheville City Schools had not even begun, so I'll tell you what he did here, and it was a great achievement. Catherine, will you put it back to me for just a moment? He certainly won the attention of the city school committee because they made him the founding principal of Beaumont Street School. He was the principal who opened the school in 1888, had the keys in his hands, I'm sure. He was responsible also for teaching 28 third graders. So the principals in those days were called principal teachers. That's where that name principal comes from. And in addition to administering the school, evaluating teachers, he had 28 third graders in a crowded substandard Beaumont building. Zoe gave you some salary figures on teachers, which showed the gap, and it actually widened between white teacher salaries and black teacher salaries. Well, Mr. Lipscomb was paid $40 a month, while the principals of the two white schools earned $70 and $75, almost twice as much as this distinguished black principal's salary. Now, he left the city and the school system after 2 years to work on his many other projects, but he came back. And on good terms. If you'll put up the Catholic Hill slide, please. He came back to Asheville and became the second principal of the recently opened Catholic Hill School, where he also taught 5th and 6th grades, the oldest students in the school at that time. I think this was his proudest achievement, becoming the principal of that school and building up the high school curriculum. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But this was the school that opened in 1892, the first school building black people were given by the school committee that was built expressly as a school. It was a brand new building in 1892, and it's the building that tragically burned in 1917 with a loss of, I think, 7 students' lives. Black families in Asheville, while he was in this school, were putting pressure on the committee, on him, on the Board of Aldermen, to create a full high school curriculum extending up through 10 grades. That was standard in the nation at the time. If you had 10 grades of education, that was considered a high school education. And it was Lipscomb's job as the principal to build up and expand the curriculum at Catholic Hill, gradually adding the higher grades as he could. He himself taught the most advanced students in grades 6 through 10. This was his greatest achievement in Asheville. He spoke about it that way, building up the first black high school. Now, put up the YMI slides, please. Now, as if that were not enough to keep him busy, he served as president of the YMI, the Young Men's Institute. At the same time, he read law, as Zoe mentioned earlier. He read law and became one of the first 2 black men admitted to the Asheville bar, and he recruited young black men for the Spanish-American War. While I was a teacher, I thought I was busy, but when I look at the careers of some of the black teachers, especially these first 2 that I've talked with you about, I think, well, I should have done more. He left Asheville one last time in 1901, moved through North Carolina doing religious and educational work, and returned to Asheville and died in 1912. Returned in 1912 and died in 1917 at age 58 or 59. Have you ever heard the expression, he didn't rust out, he wore out? That really applies to this man. He died at only the younger age, I regard it as young, age 58 or 59, and I'm sure the very demanding schedule he kept up throughout his life caused him to wear out. He certainly didn't rust out. His funeral was held at Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. Remember, he was a Baptist minister, and he is buried in Asheville. Zoe, tell us about Hester Ford.
Catherine, we have two more teachers. Should we run through them briefly? Keep going? Okay. If you want to put the slide of Hester up, with her second husband, Walter S. Lee. Mrs. Ford, she was simply listed that way in the first several newspaper notifications about her teaching at Beaumont. And it took me quite a long time to figure out who she was. She was one of the first two Black teachers that had to teach 85 first grade students, most likely all in one room when Beaumont School opened. Her life story is almost unfathomable to me, and so I want to make sure I just talk about at least the beginning of her life. She was born Hester Walker in 1861 to Amanda Walker in Plymouth, North Carolina. If you want to bring up the map, this was 4 years before the end of the Civil War when Hester was born, and with the insert of the map, you can see Plymouth located there on the coast southeast of Edenton. Plymouth would have been in Washington County. And if you leave the map up, I just want to give a quote from the National Encyclopedia of the Colored Race. Amanda Walker was refugeed from Eastern North Carolina during the Civil War to Salisbury. And this map also shows Salisbury, if you're not familiar with it. They're above Charlotte, Concord, and then Salisbury. Thanks. That information in the encyclopedia is under an entry for Hester's brother, John Wakefield Walker, who was still alive at the time it was published in 1919. So I would think that all the facts are correct. And I was able to find Amanda Walker in the 1870 census with Hester, age 12, living in Salisbury with a white family. So the good news there is they weren't refugeed to a refugee camp, but into a white family further west where they would have been safe. In 1880, Hester married Remus Ford. I'm not sure what happened to him, but they were living in Salisbury in a household together with Amanda Walker, Hester's mother, and Edmund Holt. Assumed marriage. Amanda always kept her maiden name. And there were also two other sisters of Hester's, Emmeline and Willie, and also John in that household. Also at this same time period, unfortunately, to read, the children were all working in a tobacco factory. The Walker and the Holt family later moved to Asheville, where Holt worked on the railroad. For some amazing way, Hester Ford was managed to attend Livingstone College in Salisbury. And the first two women graduated from that school, African-American, was in 1888. And it's very likely that Hester was one of those first two women, being the first two women in North Carolina to earn a bachelor's degree. That encyclopedia entry also, I'm sure from John's words, credits his mother, Amanda Walker, who was obviously a woman of ambition, as firing him up and giving and encouraging him zeal to render Christian service in his lifetime. He too was another founder of the YMI and became a well-respected physician in Asheville, opening his own sanitarium. Lee Walker Heights was named for him and Walter S. Lee, the later principal and Hester's second husband. So from John's description of their mother, Amanda, we can imagine where Hester also got her determination, which fueled her life as an educator. She was also mainly responsible for John's education, who also attended college in Salisbury to begin with. After moving to Asheville, Amanda died here in 1897. And At the time that Hester Ford was hired by the school committee in 1887, she continued to teach here through the 1890 school year before moving across the mountain to Morristown, Tennessee. In Morristown, she married Tennessean Walter S. Lee, and I like to think she was the inspiration between them both moving back to Asheville, which they did in 1905, Walter Lee becoming the principal of Hill Street School, and Hester began teaching at Hill Street School and then moved to teaching at Catholic Hill School when Walter Lee was moved as principal to Catholic Hill. That would have been 1909. So besides Hester's beginning years, starting in 1888, she continued to teach when they returned from 1906 through 1916 and was principal of Southside Elementary in 1912 and 1913. And this was at a time when very few women of either race were giving principalships. So after Catholic Hill School burned, and about 6 or 7 years later, when they finally built Stevens Lee High School, the school board realized they needed to rename the school. And I quote, leading colored, that the board consulted, lost my teleprompter. The board consulted with leading colored citizens and members of the National Association of Advancement of the Colored Race, as well as other colored organizations. So on April 25th, 1922, the new school was officially named Stevens Lee High School for Professor Edward S. Stevens, the first principal, and for Hester Lee, who gave many years of her life as a teacher of the colored in the city, unquote. Unfortunately, Hester Lee died just less than 2 months after the school had honored her by naming Stevens Lee. The devotion and admiration that Black people held for Hester were well known, and the name of the school made them official. We're sure that many wonderful stories about Hester Lee have been lost as people who knew her have passed on, and we really hope that this biographical sketch will help later generations understand how important Hester Lee was to Asheville. Her life experiences, educational achievements, and high status as a teacher told her students that they too could succeed if they set their sights high. The last picture shows Hester's tombstone. She's buried at Riverside Cemetery in Asheville. Thanks.
I think I'm on again. We have one more teacher to tell you about. If you'll put her image up, Catherine. Mary Dixon. Mary Dixon was Isaac Dixon's daughter. Now you remember Isaac from the early part of our presentation. If you live in Asheville, you already are familiar with the name Dixon because we have a school named for Isaac Dixon now. Miss Dixon was the only Asheville native in the original 5 Black teachers. She was a modestly educated young woman who was only 17 or 18. Now stop and let that sink in. Only 17 or 18 when she started teaching first grade at Beaumont Street School. Imagine that. When you understand next that on the first day of school, she and the older and much more experienced Hester Ford, Zoe just told you about her, faced the challenge of teaching 85, now let that sink in, 85 first graders, probably all crowded into one large room. It was not a general introduction to teaching. It couldn't have been easy, and she was lucky to have Mrs. Ford as her mentor. As I mentioned, her father Isaac was Isaac. He had been born a slave in Shelby, North Carolina, moved to Asheville in 1868, and 3 years later, Mary was born here and grew up here. I like to think, and I know this is true, but we don't have this in the documents, that a lot of her students would have known her from growing up next to the Dixons in the East End. The Black population of Asheville was not all that large. And you can just hear kids talking, you know, how do you like school? Well, guess who my teacher is? Who? It's Mary. You know, Mary, my older brother used to play with her. Yeah, yeah. Well, there she was, age 17 or 18, teaching first grade with Hester Ford to 85 first graders. It was criminal to give two teachers that many first graders, especially considering the awful learning conditions created by the building. If you'll put up the next slide, please, Trinity Chapel School. This is the school where Mary got her education. This was Trinity Chapel, the forerunner of St. Matthias, the Episcopal Church. And in the basement of this building, this older building, the Episcopal Church ran a parochial school. Isaac Dixon and his family all went to school there. Apparently, Isaac and his wife did not know how to read and write when they got to Asheville, and they took their kids with them, and there was a curriculum of literature and religion. So talk about learning the hard way, you know, and thank goodness for this parochial school before the public schools were available. Now, like Harrison Brown, who also went to school here, down in the basement, Mary Dixon probably did not have formal education beyond the basic literacy skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, along with literature and religion, that she received at this school. She did have the opportunities to upgrade her teaching skills in the teacher institutes that were often held in Asheville. But let me put things into perspective for you. We're talking about the 1880s and early 1890s. Even the small amount of education that she had would have set her apart from most blacks in the city and many whites. So her literacy skills, such as they were, modest, still made her an educated person in the eyes of the community. She taught only 3 years at Beaumont Street before she married in 1885 and had at least one child. After her husband died only 3 years later, she returned to the classroom. She married again, and as soon as she was married, she quit teaching again. You get the idea that teaching was not so much a career for her as it was an economic necessity. Her career was modest. I've used that word several times. Compared to the other four teachers, it seems clear that she preferred the quieter domestic life to working outside the home. Teaching was not easy under the best of conditions, and she worked in some of the worst. But for her, teaching was a matter of economic necessity. It was a job, pure and simple, as it still is for many teachers. But we can be sure that Mary Dixon left her mark on the young children she taught. The last image, please, Catherine. Zoe and I are really fond of this photo. This is the kind of student these teachers gave their all for. This young woman standing probably close to where Stevens Lee was later located, circa 1897, and she's what it was all about. We've talked a lot about teachers. We should have talked more about students, because the students were the object of what the teachers were trying to do. And that's what Zoe and I have for you this morning. We both rushed a little bit at the end to get things within the time frame, and I believe we have time for some questions.
Thank you all both so much. So for those of you who have questions, what I'm going to do is make it so I can see everyone. If you want to use that raise hand function, you can use the chat to type out a question, or if you can't find the raise hand, you can see there's a little smiley face with a plus sign, and you can give me a thumbs up and let me know that you've got a question. So here's a question you all may or may not know the answer to. Did the Episcopal Diocese support Trinity Chapel School financially?
Yes.
Do you know to what extent?
My supposition is that because the school was held in the basement of the church, probably people from the church were the instructors. And so that's a human subsidy, and the space, I'm sure, was given gratis without any charge or any kind of rent. Zoe,
It was also, excuse me, Joe, it was also seen as a mission church of Trinity Episcopal. And at that time, when the group of visitors visited the Reverend S.V. Berry, who was the first Black to be a priest at that church, was priest of the church and also principal of the school.
Okay.
So the whole work was seen as a mission of Trinity.
Do you have any other questions?
Catherine, I saw several flashing on the screen. I don't know whether you can retrieve those.
Yeah, I've got those.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of thanks. Someone whose mother and father both graduated from Stevens Lee. Woohoo!
Wow.
Wonderful.
Go Bears. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, there we go. Can you talk a little bit about county schools for African Americans?
I actually have not researched that. I would like to at some point, but obviously they were ahead of the city schools. I believe North Carolina was from a charter from the state, could have started public schools 5 years earlier, but it took that long to get the vote to pass. So the county was in there first. We're also working to first document all of the elementary schools that came up prior to integration, the feeder schools, because the teachers there were just as amazing.
Stephen, I would add that the Beaumont Academy School was the county school for Blacks in Asheville. I would imagine students came in from outside of the city limits because it was all in the county's jurisdiction. It would seem that Thomas Patton thought that that was an example of a school for poor children. That was still the outdated view he had of tax-supported schooling. And he didn't mention that school specifically, but he suggested that Black kids and other poor kids could be provided for by the state fund, which came through the county. So and the school reformers here in the city schools tried to break away from that image of public schools as poor schools.
Steve, I will add to that I've been working with the folks at the Alexander Chapel Baptist Church, and it seems like basically as soon as the city took over Beaumont Street School, then the county started building other small schools. So it was about 1890 when the first school for African American kids was in Leicester, and they established one there at Alexander Chapel and another one on Newfound. So there were two in the Leicester area, at least, that I know of. And then in Black Mountain, they were establishing, Black Mountain as a city, as a town, had its own school system that popped up about the same time.
There was also an elementary school for blacks on Reams Creek.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all so much.
Let's see. There's one more, and then I have something I wanted to say earlier. I'll throw in at the very end.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. On our Zoom call this morning, we believe we had people from way outside of North Carolina. We had, I believe, one person from Pennsylvania, maybe one from Alabama, one from DC for sure, one from Ohio, and from the great state of Tennessee, we had someone. So that's the power of Zoom. And although it's a new tool for all of us, it's perfect to help us get through these virus times. And we're grateful for all of you for Zooming in with us. Atlanta, Georgia. All right. Just saw that on the screen. We appreciate all of you very much.
Absolutely. So like I said earlier, we are going to be doing this every Tuesday at 11 o'clock. You do have to register, and you can register via the library events calendar, sending me an email at packnc@buncombecounty.org, or you can give me a call at 828-250-4709. And if you have a question that hits you an hour or two from now, go ahead and send an email to packnc@buncombecounty.org, and we'll get you in touch with who you need to get in touch with, or find you an answer here in the North Carolina room. So go ahead, mark your calendars for next week. We'll have Sarah Jones Decker is joining us. She has recently published a book about all of the shelters and lean-tos on the Appalachian Trail, and she's a farmer in Marshall. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her. So again, thanks everyone. This will be available on YouTube and Facebook by 5 o'clock today.
Go, Catherine.
Go, Joe. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.